So in regards to that, to the curses, um, it talks about being a taunt and a curse, also having nicknames. White America loves making fun of blacks, um, but we didn't come up with these names. They came up with all these names, and even uh, mocked us with the black faces back in the day, when white people would paint their faces black and their either lips white or they were painted red. And as you can see, um, Spike Lee often talked about a lot of movies that Tyler Perry makes as being modern day buffoonery and coonery, and they had a little beef going on regarding the stuff that Tyler Perry is putting out in terms of his movies and TV shows. And here we see Amos and Andy, 1944, the blackface, making mockery of black people. Dr. Boyce Watkins, when the TV series Empire came out, he was very displeased, and he quoted that when Fox Network released the new show Empire, Dr. Boyce Watkins said that he was concerned about what I might. This is his quote saying. He says, "I was concerned about what I might see on the screen. Fox is not known for producing the most favorable images of black people, so I figured the show wouldn't be any different. For some reason, black dysfunctionality makes for great television, and there is a long line of white guys getting rich off of our willingness to celebrate all that makes us miserable. If you do the research, you might notice some of the same things I've seen in this ghettofied hood drama. Pimps, hoes, thugs, gangsters, emasculated or demasculated black men, and all kinds of other kinds of stereotypical coonery that many of us have grown tired of seeing portrayed on the screen." So he's basically letting you have it by saying that black people should be getting tired of seeing the same ghettofied drama on the TV screens where we're portrayed as no good, shiesty. You can't get anything on our own unless it's something illegal that we have done to get there, and whether it's involved with gangster or thugs or pimps or demasculating black men or worshiping material things or sexual dysfunction or infidelity. These are all things that they show us on these TV shows, Empire being one of them, which is a very popular show. And here we see different ads they had up. This one's says "Honey, that's all," and here we see the mockery depiction of a black girl eating some honey. More coonery and buffoonery you see here, how they used to depict black people, and then even when the white people used to paint their faces. Coonery and buffoonery. Where does it end? We saw it back in the day with Buckwheat and the Little Rascals, and you see here this coon, coon, coon. These are words by Gene Jefferson, music by Leo Friedman. We know Friedman is a Jewish last name, so even the Jews back then were mocking black people. Movie Bamboozled came out, starring Damon Wayans and Savion Glover and Jada Pinkett, Tommy Davidson. Kind of shed light on this, and as you can see here, Spike Lee also blasted a lot of Tyler Perry's movies and his TV sitcoms. Right here, this picture says the world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. With the white family in the car, with the black people are in line. It could be the unemployment line. It could be the line to get food. But the picture shows at the top shows a different way of living that the white America has in comparison to black America. Here we see the coonery and buffoonery of Aunt Jemima, a typical obese black woman with a headscarf, serving the white man pancakes with butter, and she's talking in her broken English. The pancakes piping hot, and all that supper menu. So, and here we see down here we see different images of coonery and buffoonery with Shanae or Martin and Big Mama and Tyler Perry's movie, and you see Jimmy Fox here in Living Color. So curses Israel, Deuteronomy 28:43 to 44. The stranger that is within thee shall get up very high above thee, and thou shalt come down very low. He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail. Blacks borrow money from every other race, and we primarily work for every other race. Because we don't own anything, we are always subject to working for other people, who in most cases are not our own people. Because we don't have generational wealth, because we don't have an inheritance, we haven't been passed down anything or taught anything, we have to borrow from other races, usually with high interest rates attached to it. And this further puts us into financial slavery, well into our 30s and 40s and sometimes even our 50s. By the time we figure it out, start changing our ways financially. Deuteronomy 28:44, this man right here is approving the loan for a black person. He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. Even in ancient times, the Israelites, they would constantly have to do business with other countries during the times where they were going through the curses. But here we see it in modern day times, we see it happening today. How many times in this picture right here, you see a black couple at the car dealership, the white person standing behind the desk, usually the one that's going to take your car loan application and see if you get approved. Well, how many times have we went into the car dealership knowing what car we want, but ending up getting the car we don't want? Well, thanks to manipulative lending institutions that favor whites and other races and don't favor blacks, many blacks end up getting the car that they don't want, but they end up getting tricked and duped into having to pay more interest on their vehicle that they don't want than other races. This amounts to high car payments for a car you really didn't want, in addition to high car insurance payments based on your area that you live at. If you live around mostly black people, most likely your car insurance is going to be higher. If you live around mostly white people, your car insurance will be lower. It doesn't matter if these black people are just normal citizens that don't commit any crimes. If your zip code is associated around more black people than white people, most likely your car insurance will be higher than the white person. Don't worry though, if you don't make your payments, the dealership usually that the blacks go to, especially in the inner city, it will remotely disable your vehicle, repossess it back, and then sell it on the lot for just about the same price as you bought it for, possibly a year later. And this cycle continues on for the next black customer. So it's like just a cycle of getting duped and had and took, like Denzel Washington says in the speech, Malcolm X movie. So we also see here that college loans also, who the main people getting approved for college loans. A lot of blacks say that the majority of the problem, the reason why they don't go to school or enroll in school is because of the cost of financial aid and student loans, and the cost of school, period, and tuition and books, room and board. Oftentimes, student loans don't cover everything, even if you are using unsubsidized or subsidized student loans, and even grants, it will not cover your whole total bill at the end of the day for going to college. So then that leaves you with a bill that you got to pay, otherwise you can't go to college, and that's even before having to buy the books. So, but depending on if you're black or white, it could be a problem. It'd be not much of a problem for a white person. For a black person, it seems to be a problem. Now, the government's Parent Plus loan qualifications resulted in more than about 14,000 historically black college university students from not being able to return to school in recent fall years that raised several important questions. The parents, as you know, may apply for the Parent Plus loan to pay for college expenses that remain after their child has exhausted other sources of financial aid. So the critics of the Parent Plus loan argued that prior to the stricter eligibility requirements that now examine parents' credit history for the past 5 years instead of the previous 90 days, families that can least afford to incur debt were saddled with burdensome loans, resulting in an inordinate number of defaults. When you default, most likely the loan people are not going to give you a loan because they're going to see your default history and your credit history. If you make the requirements of getting a Parent Plus loan based on credit, you know that black people are usually in financial bondage, and it makes it harder for them to get, even the family, the parents, to get Parent Plus loans to help out their children, especially the children have money to pay up the rest of the school costs for them to go to school. So they thought it was good intentions, notwithstanding the Department of Education essentially, though, made it even more difficult for students with low-income families to attend college. Without education, we know that black people in America are not getting anywhere. Without some kind of career or degree certificate, and you're essentially an employee and can be easily eliminated. And usually the black person is more easily disposable, eliminated in corporate white America than any other race. That's the reason why we have high unemployment rates in blacks and Latinos in America. But things are a little bit different for other races. As you can see here, the Jews, if you are a Jew, your mother's a Jew, and you can go to the website, the Hebrew Free Loan. As you can see here is the interest-free lending since 1897. So it's over 100 years ago. They have interest-free lending, and all you need to do is click on one of the tabs, apply for a loan. If you want to donate some money, if you're super rich, you just want to donate some money to this Hebrew Free Loan Fund account, and you can do that to help other Jews. And it says here, the Hebrew Free Loan is here to make your life a little easier when faced with new and challenging financial situations. This is for Jewish people, not black people. We help members of the Jewish community become and remain self-sufficient by providing zero-interest loans through our personalized, confidential, and respectful application process. So they make it very easy. And what they do is they say, of course, we want other Jews to support this so we can make life easier for our children. So the support us part says that if you give a gift, your gift to the Hebrew Free Loan is more than just a donation. It's a chance to send a student to medical school, build a better future for a child, launch a new business venture, help a family to purchase a new home, and support innovative projects in our community. Notice how they say our community. Your generous donation helps thousands of Jews in our community achieve their goals and become successful. African Americans, we don't have an African American free loan website where we can get car loans and home loans and business loans. Even though there's more African Americans in America than there is Jews. African Americans again make up 14%. It's roughly about 45 million African Americans or black people in America. But yet, despite all the wealth that some African Americans have in America, we do not have this type of website that we can go to and get interest-free loans. People need to wake up. So here we go again. We should look at the slide. You see, a lot of times loan applications for blacks are rejected. Car loan applications are rejected. A lot of times you run out of cash. You need cash for a certain thing because you don't have money for a loan. The loan didn't give you any money, so you got to go to check and go or cash advance that's owned by the Arabs and owned by other races to get some money. And in turn, you will pay them back interest, so they're actually making money off of black people. You also have the American Diamond and Jewelry Loan, which are set up strategically in areas that have low socioeconomic conditions, such as in Michigan and Detroit, as well as in Pontiac. There's strategically placed so that people can pawn anything they have, from wedding rings and jewelry to TVs and laptops, guns and mink coats, all because the economy is so hard for blacks. In this report right here, FDIC revealed that 21% of African American families didn't have bank accounts. For this reason, the Arab man, and the white man, and Jewish man knows that we have to have an institution that's going to be able to cash our checks if we don't have a bank account. That's where the check cashing store comes into play, where you can cash a check for a small fee that they get to make a profit off of you, and at the same time you can also pay your bills there too. They make a profit off of blacks every day. These check cashing stores are really not seen in the suburbs because they're in the inner cities and designed to take our money, just as the curses of Israel talks about. Now, the curses of Israel, Deuteronomy 28:45-46 says, "Moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and overtake thee, till thou hearkenest not unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and his statutes which he commanded thee." And it says, "They shall be upon thee for a sign and for a wonder, and upon thy seed or children forever." Now, forever means even until now, if we are continually disobedient, until the Son of Man is also seen coming in the clouds with power and great glory. This is 3 verses after this verse right here. Actually, in Luke 21:27, it talks about when our redemption will come. So many people, when they read the curses of Israel and they go through Deuteronomy and it says forever, they can't fathom how could we be paying for something that our forefathers did. Can this really go on forever, and why? And can it change? Yes, it can change. But it all starts off with if my people, the people that God has chosen to be his people, set apart amongst all the nations of the world. The Bible says, if my people, and as you see here, if my people is talking about African Americans in America and blacks scattered through the world, the slave trade. Here we see African black Hebrew Israelites praying as we should be, also in the land of Israel, if my people. But here we see, if my people, these are the European Ashkenazi Jews. No, these are not God's people. These are descendants of Japhet, and therefore are considered Gentiles. These are not the chosen seed, the children of Israel. Even Latin Americans, which have Negro stock and also Native American Taino stock, scattered throughout the Spanish colonies and the Caribbeans and the West Indies and Lesser Antilles, and also in the Americas, South America, Central America, and North America. If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. This is in 2 Chronicles 7:14. So forever and ever does not have to last forever if we are obedient to what God has called us to do, which is humble ourselves and pray and seek his face and turn from our wicked ways, meaning that we have to turn from our wicked ways and keep the commandments and do what the Bible tells us to do. So slaves of African descent and black people have suffered for what seems to be an eternity without any sign of positive change. The descendants of African slaves have been dying all across the world, and the populations of these blacks have been decreasing steadily compared to other races. The population of African Americans is 13 to 14% compared to 17% for Latinos. Even though blacks have been here since America since 500 years, many blacks believe that the problems that we face all across the world are unfortunately not going to change. Many are starting to realize that it's not just bad luck or it's just something just had to happen to black people, but also that it has to be a divine punishment or curse. Many people, however, will blame that all the suffering, persecution, and injustice that blacks face is because of the curse of Canaan or Ham from the Bible and from Catholic doctrine and teaching from the black Christian church that we are Gentiles and we are Canaanites. This is also incorrect. This is teaching doctrines of ignorance. We must read our Bible. There's a reason why blacks can't just go to work and go home without being messed with. There's a reason why we can't seem as the people to get ahead compared to every other race. There was also a reason why blacks have to fight suppression brought by colonization from other races such as the European, British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, the German, Portuguese, and the Arabs. There is a reason that all over the world blacks are suppressed socially, politically, and economically. People of color are usually the lowest of caste systems, and the majority races in jail. The jails are being built and profiting off of blacks and Latinos. The curses that blacks face are a continuation of the curses of Israel prophesied by God. In other words, it was the Hebrew Israelites that were stolen from Africa and scattered across the four corners of the earth, not the European Ashkenazi Jews that were in the Holocaust for only 12 years, which was only one part of the earth, and they were not scattered. They were already living there when Hitler was born and rose to power and decided to wreak havoc on them in their land. They was already living there. They weren't scattered there. They were living there. So a lot of times, like they said before, everyone wants to say curse of Canaan, curse of Canaan, curse of Canaan. But people need to know that if all blacks were to come from Canaan, then this would mean that we are also of Israelite stock, because we know that the Bible says that the children of Israel intermarried with the Canaanites for thousands of years. Either way people look at it or want to look at it, there is no denying that blacks across the world claim that have the same claim to being the children of Israel as the white European Jews. Here we see is a picture of a Canaanite man with the typical Canaanite headband, sitting down, drinking what appears to be maybe beer with his, or some kind of a drink with his Egyptian wife. This is taken from the 18th dynasty, 1350 BC, a memorial stone, Egyptian memorial stone of a mercenary Levantine soldier. Levant means the land of Canaan, that area. The Canaanites were black. Abraham was not supposed to, I was told not to have his seed intermingle with the Canaanites, but they still did. Where's the proof? The proof is in your Bible, your King James Bible, your New International Version, English Standard Version, Good News Bible, Clear Word Bible. Doesn't matter what Bible you read. In Judges 3:5 it says, "And the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites," the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. These are all Canaanite tribes. And here's the kicker. It says, "And they took their daughters to be their wives, and they also gave their daughters to their sons, and served their gods." And so you see that the bloodline was infiltrated with the Canaanites. And so Ezra 9:1-2, it also says that now when these things were done, the princes came to me, saying, "The people of Israel and the priests, the Aaronites and the Levites, have not separated themselves from the people of the lands, doing according to their abominations, even of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, even the Egyptians and the Amorites. For they have taken of the daughters themselves, they've taken these nations their daughters for themselves and for thy sons, so that the holy seed have mingled themselves with the people of the lands." Ezra lived around 500, 400 BC, so even about 1,000 years after the Exodus, they still were intermarrying and having children with the Canaanites. Curse of Ezra, Deuteronomy 28:48 says that, "Therefore shalt thou serve thy enemies, which the Lord shall send against thee in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee." So what race of people were enslaved in nakedness, without clothes, shoes, or jackets, in hunger and in thirst, and with literally a yoke of iron around their neck? Was it the European Jews during the Holocaust? Did they have a yoke of iron around their neck? Were they completely naked? Or was it the African Hebrew Israelites that were taken away from Africa into many nations miles and miles away? Elephantine Island in 5500 BC, the Israelites settled there as an island in the middle of the Nile River in South Egypt. After the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586 BC, the Israelites went to Egypt with Jeremiah. Jeremiah prophesied what was going to happen to the Israelites by Babylon. These Israelites went with Jeremiah into Egypt, although some people believe the Israelites left much earlier escaping persecution by the way the lost 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel, who were deported by the Assyrians in 722 BC from Assyria to Babylon and then to Egypt along the Nile River, landing on the Elephantine Islands. So they're basically saying that they believe, many believe that some of the Israelites were able to escape before being led away captive by the Assyrians. And these Israelites that escaped and also went down into Egypt, Arabia, and this area. And then around the time of Jeremiah, they also went down into Egypt and set up in Elephantine Island. But as we see here, the pictures, you see a man with a yoke of iron around his neck. They had different ways to fashion up this this yoke. This is a collar basically to prevent the slaves from escaping. And you can see here that this yoke of iron is the same kind of yoke that they have on cows or other animals. And usually it's attached with chains. Usually the slaves were chained to each other so they couldn't run away. Sometimes they even had it on their ankles, on their feet, as you can see in the pictures. Deuteronomy 28:49-50 says, "The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue or language thou shalt not understand. They are a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show any favor to the young." The white man and Europeans has always been involved in conquering and colonization of many nations, including the Americas, Africa, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Australia, Philippines, and the West, East, and Lesser Indies, or Antilles. They continued the enslavement of the peoples of the land into whatever country they decided to bring them to. It didn't matter if you were 11, 30, or 83, you still were able to be enslaved. This is also why there are descendants of India living in South Africa, Jamaica, South America, and so on. This is why we speak different languages, but all have roots in Africa, thanks to the Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Arabic people. But we don't speak Hebrew. We speak all these different languages: Spanish, like I said, French, and Arabic, and Dutch, and Portuguese. Here we see some slave children. The children were also used as slaves, no regard or favor for the young, as the curses of Israel talked about. The children of Israel spent many hours on the plantations picking cotton. The younger children may have picked 8 hours. The older children may have picked 12 hours. Children, unattended children, right here you see the sign says unattended children will be sold into slavery. When they sold slaves, this is 1855, they had 3 bucks aged from 20 to 26, strong, able-bodied, 1 wench. It's a woman, 42. She was an excellent cook. One was 23 with a 6-month-old baby. They called the baby a pickaninny. They called the men bucks. This guy right here was 52. And so you say that they had no regards for the young or the old. Whether you were a child or whether you were 52 years old, you were still able to be sold as a slave. Picture of a New Orleans slave master woman and her slave. He often took a lot of pictures with their slaves, or had pictures just as slaves by themselves, including slave children that they had birthed through rape. Here you see the children behind the picket fence, kept on the plantation so that they cannot escape. Here you see the curse of Israel, Deuteronomy 28:51, "And he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle and the fruit of thy land until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy kind, or the flocks of thy sheep, until he hath destroyed thee." Now, what's interesting with this scripture is that ever since the beginning of time, the children of Israel, at some point, they lived peacefully in Egypt. They were prosperous, and all of a sudden, the Egyptians enslaved them. And they made them use the land to help build the pyramids and to build temples. And who knows if they also raped the Israelites and used them as physical labor, and also probably invaded their territories and land once they enslaved them. and used it to their advantage. And throughout the history of the Israelites, they had times where they had peace, or they were living and they had kings and prophets, and they had times when they were under siege by the different nations around them, like the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Grecians and the Romans. But even to this day, when the Hebrew Israelites scattered into Africa and Arabia, they were not safe. At some point, they were invaded by the Muslims, invaded by the Europeans, and the Hamitic tribes living amongst them in Africa were also not akin and happy to have them there with them. And they often invaded their villages, raped their women, took people prisoner, burned down their businesses, all because they were a different ethnic group of people that had a different religion and different God. But since our time, we've known that everyone has had their eyes on Africa since way back in regards to human slave trading, the raping of use of Africa's precious metals and minerals, and oil and farmland and crops and agriculture. So they're basically sucking the land's resources as well as using the physical human people of the land. Africa is the motherland, and they all know it, and Africa has everything it needs to sustain itself in terms of farmland and fish and resources, gold, uranium, oil, livestock. It has everything, even fish from the coast, very abundant. So the U.S. and other countries know this, and they want to tap into Africa and make money off of it, while the people stay poor and the people die of disease and the people die of genocide and civil wars. And they still go into Africa to get slaves or servants for their households that they live outside Africa. And so it's a known fact that the U.S. is the world top producer of genetically modified crops, has been seeking new markets for American genetically modified crops to be placed into Africa, stated by a report by author Hadi Swanby. It says the U.S. administration strategy consists of assisting African nations to produce biosafety laws that promote agribusiness interests instead of protecting Africans from the potential threats of GM crops. So once they promise Africa they're going to help them and give them money, or they're going to do this or do that, which is usually a false promise, they will institute their genetically modified seeds into African farmland, therefore taking over and having complete ownership of the farmland, because their seeds are the ones producing harvest, and the Africans will be under enslavement of the American genetically modified food company. They tried to do this in Haiti after the earthquake, and the Haitian people said no. And that was a while back ago. But when faced with debt and poverty, sometimes money will rule over making right decisions for your people. Here we see Monsanto. If you haven't done the research about Monsanto, you can look this up. It's easily found on the internet. Monsanto is producing crops that are not of God. They are manipulating the genetic component of the DNA, and the crops are not real natural crops. And these also come with health problems that they don't tell you about. Now, the front lines of the food sovereignty war in Ghana are swelling as the national parliament gives support to the plant breeders bill. This proposed legislation contains rules that would restrict farmers, native farmers of Ghana, from ancient practices, freely saving, swapping, and breeding seeds. Under new laws protecting the intellectual property rights of biotech, these farmers from Ghana would be subject to hefty fines for growing anything that hasn't been patented by Monsanto, even if their crops were cross-pollinated, meaning that their crops have been contaminated by pollination from these genetically modified plants or vegetables being carried through air or water or animals and insects. The obviously biotech infiltrated Ghanaian government states that the new laws would incentivize the development of new seed varieties to ensure the marketability of crops. But the farmers of Ghana argue that it gives rights straight to corporations like Monsanto and not farmers who have been growing food in Ghana for centuries. Many activists and trade groups, they think that the new laws would simply give Monsanto a way to edge their biotech crops into the Ghanaian market. This bill has been dubbed the Monsanto Law for this reason. So here we see it's a map of the 21st century of Africa and the land rush that many countries have come over here to try to take advantage of Africa's resources. And you can see that Africa has a lot of resources. They have rice and corn and soybeans, sunflower, sugarcane, and they also have precious metals. And many countries such as China, Egypt, Germany, India, Jordan, Qatar, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Korea, South Korea, the Swedes, and United Arab Emirates, United Kingdom, and even the United States have taken an interest into Africa. So worldwide, Africa has up to 150. Worldwide is up to 115 acres of farmland. These are leased to foreign investors, and the bulk of that is in Africa. Most of this farmland that makes up 150 million acres globally is in Africa. Food security and the push to produce biofuels drive the land rush from these other countries outside of Africa, and this map right here shows the sampling of the land and of the resources been happening from these other countries. This all ties in with what Deuteronomy talks about, and as you see here, China's trade with Africa. This is back in 2010 in terms of billions of dollars. The number system is in. China imports many things from Africa in the billions. You know, you see right here, you see $60 billion worth of a combination of minerals, which is the most abundance that they import in from Africa. Also wood, stone and glass, and metals and other things. You know, uranium is used for our electronics and our cell phones. And so they need that from Africa. And of course, in return, China sends to Africa cars used for transportation, machinery, electrical goods like iPhones and stuff that they don't have over there, and textiles and plastics and rubbers, and also chemicals. The goods trade with Africa in 2013 in the billions of dollars is enormous, with China doing huge business with Africa in the amount of 156 billion, United States 72 billion, France 61 billion, India 57 billion, Spain 48 billion, Italy 40 billion, Germany 40 billion, the UK, Britain 34 billion, Brazil 25 billion, Japan 25 billion. This is a lot of money. This is equal to $1 trillion that people are making money off of Africa. The foreign investment in Africa 2012 was 59 billion. The rest of the world was 38.1. So they're doing more business with Africa than any other continent in the world. These are huge, major players that are dropping a lot of money investing in Africa, sucking its resources. And you got top countries such as China, France, Italy, India, United States, and Britain. But the natives of Africa not always are too happy to see foreigners in their land trying to take their resources, even though this is what the Bible talks about. Now, in South Sudan, which is an area that many of the Hebrew Israelites were known to be scattered into, and some of the South Sudan people claim Hebrew Israelite heritage. Of course, the north part of Sudan is mostly Muslim, and this is where you have the constant fighting between the Muslims of Sudan from the north and the Christians or Judaism practicing Sudanese people in the south, who are more African in appearance. This is also where Darfur happened. And as you know, if you look at the map here, it shows that the oil pipelines and all the oil, or at least 75% of Sudan's oil is in South Sudan. But there's also been a war against this. So here it says that the proxy war between the U.S. and China in the hunt for obtaining the oil in South Sudan is a heated debate right now. It's a big topic. United States African Command, which is called AFRICOM. AFRICOM's website mission statement clearly states that its mission is to confront the threat of China. They don't want China in Africa. They want to get to it first. The mission statement neglects to state exactly what the threat is to, other than the need for U.S. to advance its national interest in Africa. So this is what's going on right now. When South Sudan seceded from Sudan, they walked away with a lot of oil. They had about 75% of Sudan's oil. They was left with the pipeline, and the remaining oil was in that land. China, however, saw this, as well as the United States, and they invested heavily into Sudan to develop the oil fields, the refineries, storage facilities, pipelines, ports, and infrastructure so they can make money off of South Sudan's oil. So China lured Sudan to partner up so that they can use the money from the oil reserves supposedly to help the country. But the people of South Sudan don't see it that way. They see them coming over there to try and rip them off and take their money and leave their country poor. And the China people or government has even went as far as to send Chinese troops over there to keep the pipeline safe from South Sudan so-called rebels that are there defending their land and their oil that rightfully belongs to them, and that they believe is being manipulated by outside countries. So at the end, who really benefits? Is it China or South Sudan when they do a deal to work with the Chinese? As you can see here, pictures of Sudanese boys carrying flags, China flags. That's really a sight to see. And you see here is a representative of China. He's also standing in the back with Sudanese officials. And you see here the other picture. You see the Chinese are writing in their own language, which I don't know the Sudanese can understand. Looks like in an oil refinery or oil deposit area. And then you see the Chinese troops are there also to restore order and to keep the rebels from foiling their plans. So China, United States, and even India and the globe are in the fight, in the struggle for the oil in Sudan and South Sudan. This goes back to the curses, how they will take everything from the land and from the people. So here, this is a map of the total oil exports to China in 2010 in terms of barrels a day, thousands of barrels a day. And you see the Middle East sends a lot of oil to China, like Iran and Saudi Arabia and other areas. But West Africa contributes a lot as well. Nigeria, 878. And you see also East and Southern Africa also send about 254,000 barrels of oil to China, as well as some other countries over here. But 75% of this oil that's being sent in terms of 254 barrels of oil a day is coming from South Sudan. And this is prime area where the people of South Sudan have claimed their Hebrew Israelite heritage. And just as in the scripture talks about, and he, which in this case is China and the USA, shall eat the fruit of thy cattle, the fruit of thy land, until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy kind, or flocks of thy sheep, until he had destroyed thee. Nigeria, oil areas is known as the now Niger Delta. This is along the coast, right near Igbo land, where majority of oil has been found. And of course, the United States and China, they want to take advantage of this, and the oil companies. Saudi Arabia is at the top of oil production and crude oil growth. They are pumping out massive amounts of barrels of oil a day and shipping them out to other countries. Nigeria is also in that top 10, but in most of Nigeria's, 90% of Nigeria's revenues come from exporting oil out to other countries. As you can see here, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq and Iran, Saudi Arabia are also top players in this. In terms of crude oil production a day, Saudi Arabia is of course at the top, Iran second, Iraq is close by, and you see Nigeria is running alongside with them as well in this fight. So 2014. United States has also kicked it up. We've got a lot of oil in the United States of America. People don't know about it, but we're still dependent on it from the Middle East. And our gas prices seem to be high one minute and low the next minute, even though, according to this graph in 2014, the United States actually beat Saudi Arabia in the total oil production in terms of barrels per day. They chummed out about 20% more barrels on average every day than the leading competition. Saudi Arabia was number 2 in this graph, and Russia was also not too far behind. So Nigeria in 2014 is the only country in Africa that is the biggest oil producer, generates more than 2 million barrels of petroleum a day, but it imports refined oil product because of its refineries are not up to par and are not maintained. So even though it's making a whole lot of oil, it has a lot of oil in the land, they still have to import refined oil, which they can use for gasoline and jet fuel and diesel fuel. They still got to import this from other countries, which really doesn't make any sense. And so a woeful nation grid that only offers a few hours of electricity in certain areas on a good day has failed to generate any electricity recently because of shortages of thermal gas to fire generators. That leaves all businesses and homes in certain parts of Nigeria that can afford it dependent on diesel power generators, and the country frequently suffers fuel shortages and disruptions caused by these problems with oil refineries and the value of the dollar bill to the Nigerian currency, and dropping oil prices around the world. You see oil fields burning. Sometimes these are caused by the rebels in attack to try to prevent these outside companies from pillaging and taking advantage and making money off the land while leaving the people in the Niger Delta poor. And for this reason, many of the people in this area have went along doing their own oil refinery and selling the oil themselves. Using these pipelines in places where the oil is abundant at to get the oil, and of course the government isn't like this. So the petroleum refining process is basically the chemical engineering process that they use to refine the petroleum and make it into crude oil, which you can use then to use as liquefied petroleum gas or gasoline or petrol, kerosene or jet fuel, diesel oil, and fuel oil. So you can't use this oil until it's refined as a source of energy. Now, in regards to the Nigerian oil wars, it's known that the Independent Petroleum Markets Association of Nigeria said that the finance minister agreed uh, to pay a lot of money in terms of debt that they owe, amounts of $800 million, and it kind of was in like a locked agreement where they couldn't get any oil or gasoline imported to the country until they paid this bill. And when this happened, then the unpaid tanker drivers were able to get paid and stop striking and then deliver the oil. And this is basically come almost like a ransom type of situation where you have debt that's being disputed and you have oil that's being needed in terms of gasoline in Nigeria. And so Nigeria's government has also been hit by the lowering of gas prices all across the world, which doesn't do any good for them in terms of the amount of revenue they make from the oil that it has in the land. And also, like I talked about earlier, the massive slump in the Naira currency. So all these factors play a fact into the problems of Nigeria and its oil wars. And then you also have some of the rebels that also kind of put a damper on the refinery process in the area to pump out the oil so that it can be exported to other nations. And these militant groups, they claim that they've been attacking the Niger Delta for many years, but the Niger Delta residents claim that we know is the fact that they live in poverty, even though there's so much oil in the land. Oil is seeping into the ground and seeping into the rivers, and you can just, and it's basically also contaminating the area and making the area sick. And in this Niger Delta area, there's very few roads and there's very few decent hospitals because the manipulation of the money coming from the oil that they're taking from Africa. So this situation makes a lot of people mad, just like the people and the residents of South Sudan. These other countries are having their eyes on Africa, the land and its resources. But it's not just, they're not coming over to help Africa, they're coming over to get rich. If they really want to help Africa, they can just give a donation and help them out. So even though Nigeria is going through these problems, they been trying to up their refinery process, build some more refinery factories where they can refine the oil and pump out more barrels of oil a day. Right now, they have a capacity where they are trying to increase their refining capacity from pumping out 445,000 barrels of petroleum a day to about 1 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia at this time can pump out and refine 5 million barrels per day, and they're pushing to do about 8 to 10 million a day. So once this happens, then they'll be in a better situation once they can pump out more barrels of oil a day and sell it across the world market and make some money. But unfortunately, different things have been happening that have been preventing this process, and a lot of the citizens are upset. So as we can see, when we go along with the curse of Israel in regards to the land being used and raped by other nations, you can see that in the partition of Africa in 1885 or 1914, we see that many of the countries in Africa, once they were partitioned, the different countries took their claim. In terms of like West Africa was mainly taken over by the French. And you had the British taking over Egypt, and then parts of Sudan, also Nigeria, and then South Africa. And then you see the Portuguese with Angola, and Belgian Congo. And the French also took over Gabon, and also took over parts of Cameroon, as well as the Germans. And Madagascar was also taken over by the French and the British. And then you see over near Ethiopia, even though Ethiopia remained primarily independent, you still had the Italian Somaliland, British Somaliland, and French Somaliland. Okay. All right. So getting to the next verse of curse of Israel, Deuteronomy 28:52. Moving right along. It says right here that, and he shall besiege thee in all thy gates until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest throughout all the land, and he shall besiege thee in all thy gates throughout all the land which the Lord thy God hath given thee. So the word besiege means to surround a city, a building, etc., with armed forces and soldiers and try to take control of it. Or it means to gather around someone in a way that is aggressive, annoying. And so where can we see these examples of this throughout time? And of course, if this is supposed to be going in regards to the children of Israel, let's take a look and see what people have been under the siege. And now we know back in the days of Joseph and his brothers that they lived in Egypt in peace and prosperity for a while as he was the governor of Egypt. And after a while, the new Pharaoh came into power, and he did not like what he was seeing in regards to the children of Israel populating and becoming numerous and prosperous, and he believed that they were going to eventually overtake them and rule over the throne. And then, you know, they ended up enslaving the Israelites. And then years later, 700 BC, you had the Assyrians that laid siege to Israel. And then a couple hundred years after that, you see the Babylonians. And then the Persians defeated the Babylonians and allowed them to come rebuild the second temple. And then after that, you had the Grecians that came, sacked Judea and Egypt and took control of this area under Alexander the Great, who then split his kingdom into the Seleucid kingdom. And then after that, for many years, until around about 150 BC, the Greek Maccabean dynasty, which I'll explain later, they came and took over around the time right before King Herod and his family came into power and ruled over Judea and Samaria as a Roman client state. So, if you look here, like I talked about, Assyrian attack was in 721 BC to about 701 BC. Babylonian attack 605 BC to 582 BC. The Grecian attack 330 BC. Roman attack was in 70 AD when they destroyed the second temple in Jerusalem and completely demolished the second temple and the revisions that King Herod had made to it. Every stone was laid to the ground, just as Jesus, I'm sure, predicted. And the Battle of Khaybar was another battle where the Muslims around 600 AD, 629 AD, just in its fresh start, they laid siege to one of the areas where a lot of Jews were living at in near Medina in Arabia and the Hijaz, somewhere over there near the Hijaz mountain area. And then you see later, of course, during that time from 600 AD on through, we experienced the Arab slave trade for over 1,000 years, in which they ransacked many parts of Africa, and then after that, followed by the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Europeans and the transatlantic slave trade. And here we are in 1993. After slavery, of course, was been abolished, you have the Rwandan genocide of the Tutsi by the Hutus, and a lot of the Tutsis, the Tutsi Jews that are living in Rwanda, many of them were slaughtered, hundreds and thousands of them were killed, and the majority Hutus had a victory in that war. And then you have the Belgian Congo takeover, and we'll talk about later how the Niger Congo area was a hotspot for Hebrew Israelites back in the day, and the people that settled there. So that was in 1908 AD, and then we had the Biafra War with the Nigerian uh, uh, Biafrans or Igbos against the rest of Nigeria because they wanted to succeed from Nigeria. But the Nigerian government ended up winning in the end after about 3 years, from 1967 to 1970 AD. And all the Igbos know about this, even the Yorubas, who are in the southwest part of Nigeria. And you will see here later on 2003 AD, we know of the genocide that happened in Darfur, and the civil war battle between North Sudan, mostly the Arabs, and South Sudan, which many of the South Sudan claim Hebrew Israelite heritage. So with the Tutsi and the Hutu, today, when they had this war, there was a lot of fear, a lot of humiliation, a lot of despair. A lot of people died in the Rwanda genocide. They did movies about it. The Tutsi Jews, many of them remember this very well. The Tutsi Jews of Kush are scattered in different areas in Africa, such as Rwanda, eastern Congo, Uganda, and northern Tanzania. And we'll explain later how the Jewish connection comes to the Tutsi people. So the Tutsi African customs were such as circumcision, menstrual seclusion of women, and the marriage practice called levirate, which requires a man to marry the widow of his deceased brother. These practices mirrored the Old Testament and further strengthened the Christian belief in their Israelite biblical ancestry. And during this time, it was reported that the UN troops stood by and watched the carnage and death of many Tutsis. The French and Belgian forces were also there, and they saw exactly what happened. This is a picture of a Tutsi man. So the Tutsi people originated in Ethiopia when it was known as Kush and was a Jewish kingdom. There are numerous references to Kush in the Bible. You can spell with a K or with a C. The Jewish kingdom fell in 1270 AD. As a result, several clans, including the Ben Zakwi clan, moved south and west to an area which they called Havilah. That's in the book of Genesis, or the African Great Lakes region, which constitutes of Burundi, Rwanda, parts of Uganda, Tanzania, and Congo. So a lot of different lakes in that area. In this region, these clans reconstituted the South Kushite Empire, which lasted from 1270 AD to 1527 AD. In the South Cushitic Empire, the laws of Moses were the laws of the land, but it was the laws of Moses as they were remembered through oral transmission. This was basically going off of the Old Testament, Mosaic law, or some people may call it Karaite Judaism, not the Babylonian Talmud Judaism that the European Jews practiced. So around the time of the World War I, Belgium became the colonial ruler of Rwanda, Burundi, and eastern Congo, which were in the historic domain of the Tutsi. Under the Belgians, the Catholic Church began to destroy methodically the basis of the Tutsi Jewish religion. Rwanda, Burundi, and Kivu were separated and placed under different figureheads. The Jewish Rwandan king was exiled, and his converted son was placed on his throne. An annual gathering of Tutsi lasting 8 days used to take place in what is now Rwanda. The Catholic hierarchy noted that the rituals of the festival were in accordance with the Old Testament rites of the Sukkot, which is one of the feast holidays. And in 1917, the festival was banned by the Belgians. Here we see a picture of the Hutu Rwandan military personnel. They believed that they had to drive out all of the Tutsis. And the Tutsis had their own Rwandan Patriotic Front group. That was a group of refugees that they supposedly invaded Rwanda. So you got two people basically trying to claim their part of the land. So the genocide that took place in the context of the Rwandan Civil War and ongoing conflict beginning in 1990 between the Hutu-led government and Rwandan Patriotic Front was largely composed of Tutsi refugees who had came and brought their families, who had fled also to Uganda following early waves of the Hutu violence against the Tutsis. Between 700 BC and 15 AD, a number of Bantu groups migrated into Rwanda, and we'll talk about the Bantu migrations later. Historians have several theories regarding the nature of the Bantu migrations. But one theory is that the first settlers were Hutu, and then the Tutsis migrated there later and formed a distinct racial group, which people believe were of Kushite origin, also mixed with some Hebrew Israelite heritage. Hundreds of thousands of Tutsi people died, as you see the bones and skeletons in this Rwanda genocide. Now we are moving towards the Biafran siege, or the Nigerian so-called civil war. The leader of the Biafrans was General Mika Ojukwu. He was Oxford educated. He's a Nigerian soldier. He lived 1933, just died a couple years ago, 2011. He proclaimed the short-lived Republic of Biafra in 1967. But in the beginning, under the British indirect rule, Nigeria had been crudely divided into different tribal lines. The Hausa and Fulani up north are mostly Muslims, and you had the Yorubas and the Igbos down in the south. They're mostly Christians. Unhappy at the northern heavy-handedness and discrimination, the Igbo officers staged a coup in 1966 and set up Ojukwu as governor of the eastern region, which included the oil-rich Niger Delta, which they're fighting over still to this day. When the counter-coup came 6 months later, Ojukwu refused to step down. Under pressure from Igbo militants, he declared independence for the 29,000 square mile region on May 30th, 1967. A flag was designed featuring the rising sun, which is also featured also in the Antiguan flag. The currency was issued, and the beginning of a welfare state was put in place. Ojukwu personally chose a movement from Jean Sibelius' Finlandia as the tune to the national anthem, which many Igbos know very well, in reference to the Nordic countries' resistance to foreign domination. Here we see a map of Nigeria. During this time, you had the Yoruba land over to the southwest near Benin, and you had the Igbo territory down in the Niger Delta, right next to Cameroon, on the south east side, and you have the Hausa and the Fulani at the top. 99% of them are Muslims. And like I said, most Igbos are Christians, and many are now awakening to their ancient Jewish roots passed down to them as heritage from their elders. And you see on the map, you see that for the most part, the southern part of Africa is Christian, and the upper part, North African part, is Muslim. And this is an Igbo Nigerian Jew that you see over here. So the Nigerian Civil War is properly known all over the world as the Biafran War. The Igbos will never forget it. They celebrate the day the war happened, and Heroes Day, May 30th. Was fought 1967 all the way to 1970, and basically it was the eastern part, southeastern part of Nigeria versus the rest of the country. And the Igbos, the Biafrans, declared itself an independent state, and the other part of Nigeria regarded it as an act of secession by the federal military government of Nigeria. Same thing with United States tried to succeed from British rule. And the war was fought to reunify the country. They didn't want it to be separate. It's a known fact that many Igbos hold the tradition that their people many years ago left Israel and entered into Africa. Many of the older Igbos, if you ask them, they were told back in the day if they were Israelites, or Jews, a lot of them would tell you that their grandparents taught them this and told them this when they were little kids. Of course, over the years, with westernized TV and its influence, many of the young Igbos have forgotten about this, and many of the old customs that mimic the Old Testament are not being practiced anymore, even though they were practiced back in the day. So these elders have passed on stories that they are descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. Some say they may be from the tribe of Gad, to be specific. So the Hebrews strengthened their connections to Judaism by likening their experience as a minority scattered throughout Nigeria to the Jewish diaspora, and they referred to Biafra genocide between 1967 and 1997 as another Holocaust. Here you see some Biafran troops from back in those days. Now we're shifting onto the civil war between North Sudan, South Sudan, and Darfur. The British also had their hands in Sudan and as well as Nigeria. And so following independence from Britain in 1956, Sudan became embroiled in two prolonged civil wars for the most of the remainder of the 20th century. These conflicts were rooted in northern economic, political, and social domination of largely non-Muslim, non-Arab southern Sudanese. Many of them were Christians, and many of them also claimed Hebrew Israelite heritage. Competition for scarce resources played a large role. As nomads began to compete for grazing land, traditional reconciliation measures were no longer able to settle disputes, causing the region to become increasingly militarized. The complexities of desertification, famines, and the civil war ranging between the North and South Sudan contributed to a rise in regional tensions during the 1980s. Likewise, as oil was discovered in Western Sudan, the Sudan government and international contributors became increasingly interested in the land of Darfur. Oil is one of the big reasons people fight and have wars. So in Darfur, 400,000 people were killed, 2.5 million people were displaced in other countries, other areas. Rape and murder occurred every day, and genocide happened for a long time. And the civil war has existed between North and South Sudan for more than a decade. The northern region is centered on the capital of Khartoum, which is predominantly made up of Muslims who are ethnically Arab, while groups of Christians and animists, and also people claiming Hebrew Israelite heritage, live in the south. The Khartoum government under General Omar al-Bashir wished to create a more Islamic-based government that was opposed by the southern groups and led to eventually a civil war. Not until 2005, and with heavy international influence, did the comprehensive peace agreement end the 2-decade-long civil war that had resulted in more than 2 million deaths and 4 million displaced persons in the south. And here you see pictures of people from Sudan, South Sudan. According to United Nations estimates, 2.7 million Darfuris still remain in internally displaced person camps, and more than 4.7 million Darfuris remain and rely on humanitarian aid. Back in 2011, South Sudan became the world's newest country. This was a major step towards ending the violence in Sudan. However, civilians across Sudan still remain at risk. The Mahdi tribe is one of the tribes that claim Israelite heritage. They're mostly populated in Uganda and South Sudan. Here you see pictures of them right here. So the South Sudan Jews, the largely Christian African portion of the South Sudan, has been dominated by Arab Muslims for a long time in the north, mainly in the capital Khartoum. The people of the Mahdi tribe claim to be Jews, and they've always claimed to be Jews. They've not retained Judaism as thoroughly as did the Falashas, the Beta Israel Jews from Ethiopia, which is to the east. But for generations, they have kept customs that seem to have come from the Mosaic Law in the Old Testament, and they did not learn it from the European Jews in Europe, and did not go up to Israel and ask to learn about Judaism. They always have been keeping these traditions and customs. So among Christians and non-Christians, Like the Mahdi's believed in one God, and they worshiped one God. As in the book of Leviticus, blood sacrifices were offered for sins. The worst sins required a sacrifice of a sheep, and the least sins a chicken. And this actually is also, I've talked to some people from Ghana, and they said that they do this too. Hereditary group of elders or priests decided which to sacrifice and presided over these and other ceremonies. And like I said, the Ashantis, some of the Ashantis do this as well. The dietary laws were also practiced. Certain animals were unclean, such as the pig, and cannot be eaten. And ceremonial washing of the hands was required when leaving home. Certain days of the year were set apart as holy, and on such days all was pledged to the one God of the heavens who forgave sins. The Mahdi also used the ram's horn, of the shofar, to call people together for various reasons and purposes. One guy said that his father, who was a hereditary elder, would often blow the ram's horn to gather the people together for a ceremony or to discuss a matter of importance. And this is something that the Israelites did. And if a man died, as in the Bible, his brother had to marry the widow. This is in Leviticus. It's also embedded in Mahdi culture, as is the kinsman redeemer custom found in the book of Ruth in connection with Boaz marrying Ruth. In Deuteronomy 15:19, the children of Israel were commanded to set apart for the Lord all firstborn males of their herds and flocks. None of them were to be put to work in the case of sheep, and this was a Mahdi custom as well. All males also were circumcised on the 8th day, which is in the Old Testament. So in Africa, we see that there was a lot of siege going on in hot spots and areas where many of the people there had Hebrew Israelite customs and traditions and claimed to have be descendants of the Hebrew Israelites. And we also go to America, and we see that that we had the same thing happen in certain areas where blacks had their own thing going on, like in Black Wall Street in the early 1900s, when blacks were segregated and they were prosperous on their own. They had 600 businesses, they had 21 churches, 21 restaurants, and 30 grocery stores, and 2 movie theaters, and they had private planes, 6 of them, their own airport landing strip. They had their own hospital, bank, post office, school system, law offices, and a bus system. But then over some allegations with a questionable, well, they said a white girl was raped or a white girl was talked to or aggravated, then of course the white people in that area came and they destroyed Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and this is back in 1921. So the Negro business section was laid to waste by torch, and they even had planes that dropped bombs on this city. So in Africa as well, the Hebrew Israelites, they possessed the land, but of course they were invaded, just like America was invaded and occupied by different nations of people that wanted their hands in it, like the British, who invaded and colonized and controlled Nigeria for a while, Kenya, South Africa, and other countries. And the Italians and the Mussolini, he invaded Ethiopia, and the Arabs from they invaded North Africa. The originators of North Africa invaded them, and they also invaded Arabia and the Middle East. And like I said, even in America, Black Wall Street was taken from black people while we were minding our own business. This right here, down here, is a picture of the British troops and government setting up shop in Nigeria. And you can see the British people are sitting here with a table in their typical British gear, and the Africans are sitting over there to the right. And they divided, they had divided Nigeria. They had different parts where they had controlled Nigeria, and they had divided to the north and divided to the south. And they set up their own money system, shilling. You see here the southern Nigeria, 1 shilling. And then the British lawyers and judicial system back in the day, Even the days with George Washington and all those guys, when they would dress up, they would wear these funny wigs on their head, usually all white, and they would wear the typical black outfits with a little white necktie or handkerchief, whatever you want to call it. And so the Africans, because of this colonization and rule and dominance, they adopted the same white tradition as well, even though their hair is not white, as you can see them over this picture right here. So something's clearly wrong with that picture. And these are British colonists standing over a guard of the Kenyans, because they took over the Kenyans. And so you see all throughout history, the Europeans have besieged the gates of the Hamitic people and also the Shemitic Israelite people. And they had their hands in Africa for a long time. As you can see, the division of Africa by the European countries. The French dominated the West, and you see that the Italians dominated Somaliland, and they tried to get Ethiopia, Portuguese, Angola, and Mozambique. You see the Germans, they had their hand in a lot of things, especially Nigeria and Ghana, Sudan, and then and the British and the Belgian Congo. South Africa was taken over by the Europeans, the city of Durban. Here this picture shows that their law that they had set, as you see the European kid right there at the beach, says under Section 37 of the Durban Beach bylaws, bathing, this area on the beach was reserved solely for the use of members of the white race group. So the black people were excluded from even going to their beach in South Africa near the natives of the land. And this is when the apartheid movement started. With Mandela, here we see Ethiopian soldiers ready to fight the Italian forces that were trying to lay siege to their country when their country was under rulership of Emperor Haile Selassie. The Ethiopians ended up getting the victory from outside help. But as you can see here, when Mussolini, that they invaded from the north and invaded from the south. And you had the French, where you get French Somalia, British Somalia, and Italian Somaliland. And so, like in the scripture says, and he shall besiege thee in all thy gates until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trusted them throughout all the land. So not just meaning one part of the land, but all the land. So we're going to Deuteronomy 20:53, and thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, the flesh of thy sons and of thy daughters, which the Lord thy God hath given thee in the siege and in the straitness wherewith thine enemy shall distress thee. So a lot of times people might read this and say, well, what does this mean? It says, thou shalt eat the fruit of thy body and the flesh of thy sons and thy daughters during the siege and during when the enemies come upon them and distress thee. And the question is, well, did some of the slaves resort to eating the dead in order to survive during the slave trades? And some people claim they did. It is a known fact that in some areas of the world, black tribes in Africa were known to practice cannibalism. Scattered parts. Eventually, through time, I think this practice has been eliminated in most areas, but there's probably some areas that they still practice this. So when it talks about eating the fruit of thy body and the flesh of thy sons, different people went into Africa and they studied the Africans that they were taking as slaves. Of course, they couldn't speak their language and they didn't really understand, but they just wrote about what they saw and kind of compared it to that of a savage or an animal, because they believed that the Negroes were nothing more than was subhuman, just a step above a animal or a gorilla or an ape. And so there's one guy, he was a medical doctor, R.W. Schufeldt, in the 1900s, 1906. He wrote a book, and in his book he wrote on the issue of cannibalism. And he said that, quote, that people whose social institutions are at the lowest possible level with an undiluted fetishism with the worship of ancestors for religion, coupled with torture, cruelty, slavery, and cannibalism, and a common belief in sorcery, were not checked by the presence of the European in the Middle Congo Basin. The native shambles, which is another word for butcher slaughterhouses, in the Congo Basin are still hung with the choice cuts of human bodies, and they continue to be sold in the open marketplace in that area. Many of these people see their near relatives in the Negroes of the United States. In Africa, they even barter their dead relatives, and those securing the corpses in this way eat them, and that with great relish. They will even disinter, which is take the body out the grave or a tomb or a burial place, them for the same purpose of eating them, even after decomposition has set in. Those Negroes who still practice this in Africa are several millions in number and are close to the blood relatives of the race as we have them represented in the United States. And this is also written in another book called The Heart of Africa, Volume 2, page 18 and 19, and then also in the book The Negro, A Menace to American Civilization by R.W. Schufels. He's a doctor. And as you can see, the Congo Basin, which he was talking about, is smack dab in the middle, pretty much Central Africa, in the Bantus lands, Congo, Guinea, Cameroon, Gabon, and I'll explain to you the significance of that in regards to where the Hebrew Israelites eventually scattered into when they went into Africa. So the curse of Israel, Deuteronomy 28:54 says, "So that the man that is tender among you and very delicate, his eye shall be evil towards his brother, and towards the wife of his bosom, and towards the remnant of his children, which he shall leave." And so when we played in the streets as children and in school, we saw each other as brothers. We had no ill intentions towards each other back then. When we got older, we tend to develop distrust towards our once black friends and brothers that we had when we was growing up in the same neighborhood as kids. Black on black crime is by far destroying many communities all across America. A lot of black people are dying at the hands of other blacks, ending up in the morgue and then in the grave. The stuff that happened through slavery, a lot of people say that the effects of slavery also caused a lot of distrust in each other. That's why we can't sit together, even if it means doing business, sometimes even with close family and friends. There's a lot of distrust going on. And the Bible talks about how the man is going to have his eye to be evil against his brother, his own kin, his own relatives, and in the same race and nation, and then also towards his wife, and then the children that he shall leave. And here's a picture of two boys, little. Obviously, you can tell they're brothers, but as they get older, you never know. Kids, when we play up in the school, in elementary school, middle school, eventually, some of the same kids that you frequent with at the school could be somebody that tries to rob you or kill you. And in Deuteronomy 28, it talks about 28:54 talks about this, and we see all well in the movies that we watch on TV how we are killing each other and robbing from each other and stealing from each other and conniving and trying to manipulate each other on some of these movies that are made for comedy. So we all know that the consequences of black on black violence, especially with guns, you're either going to be in jail, or you're going to be dead, or you're going to be crippled from a wheelchair, from gun paralysis. A lot of people laid up in the hospital or in the nursing home or group homes, paralyzed from gunshots. And a lot of them are young, and it destroys them because some of them have to wear colostomy bags for the stool, and they sometimes might have to wear a urine bag or a diaper or a catheter into the bladder so they can urinate. And this is only happening in the black community, and it's only majority of the people that are paralyzed because of this. It's because another black person has shot them and paralyzed them, not a white person, not an Arab person, not an Indian person, and not even a white European Jewish person. And so we see here that the positive things that we want to see is, of course, the father staying around with the children and being a family, taking care of his kids, But a lot of times in the black culture, the father ends up leaving, or the mother ends up leaving, or divorce happens, and so you have a broken family, or the father has his parenting time, and the woman has full custodial custody of the child, and so the father's kind of left out the loop, you know, and doesn't see his child but 8 to 9 days a month. And so Deuteronomy 28:54 talks about how the remnant of his children which he shall leave, and as you see here, you see a lot of single black women that are raising kids, and they don't have a father figure in the house, and it tremendously affects them growing up, because it takes a man to teach another boy how to be a man, especially if this boy has children at an early age, that he needs to teach these children how to be a man. If he's not being taught how to be a man, then how is he going to teach his children how to be a man? Because a whole bunch of women and aunties and grandmas can do their best, but sometimes it's not enough. So 2012, even going on to 2015, a large majority of black families are single parent families. In 2012, 67% of black families are single parent families. That's a lot of people. And compared to 42% for Latinos, 25% for whites, and 17% for Asians. So most Asians have two people in their household, mama and daddy. Latinos, about 75% of them in 2012, they had the father and the mother in the household. But for blacks, only about 30, or I mean, it's like 30-some% of people actually had mother and father in the household. So this all boils down to the young black boys being raised without a father, young black girls being raised without a father as well. And like I said, it negatively affects the child, whether society wants to believe it or not. And this also adds to the struggle that blacks, especially black males, face in America. The Friends of the Court, they may feel that they're helping the black family, but they're actually not. They're destroying the black family. It's dismantling the black family while parents fight over child support. They fight over parenting time, or parenting time complaints, or how much money they got to pay, instead of simply trying to make, or they basically try to make the other parent look bad in a way to get full custody. You use the child as a pawn. And often this fighting hurts the child in the long run, leaves the other parent, most often the father, feeling helpless and with nothing more than the feeling of being worthless and not needed in the child's life. And this leads to resentment towards the child, and sometimes towards the mother and the child, and it also affects the family structure, or the broken family structure, of trying to work with the mother. And we all know that the black family is essential for the success of the black race. Part-time parenting is what they want us to have. Spending more time with children obviously is more important than spending money on children, but that's the other way around when you go to the Friends of the Court. So Deuteronomy 28:59 says, we're moving along, it says, then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful, and the plagues of thy seed, even great plagues, and of long continuance, and sore sickness, and long continuance. So it's basically saying these diseases or plagues are going to last a long time, and they're going to just be chronic. And it's a known fact that black people are the sickest people in most hospitals. We rank #1 in hypertension, high blood pressure, end-stage renal disease, kidney disease, on dialysis, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, prostate cancer, amongst a host of other diseases. And these diseases are of long continuance. Like I said, these diseases, including peripheral vascular disease, sickle cell anemia, cancer, HIV, high cholesterol, these are all on the list as high numbers for the black community. And you see here pictures of black people getting the blood pressure checked, because high blood pressure runs high in the black community, even at early ages. And the result of high blood pressure unchecked, with no follow-up with the medical doctor, resorts into kidney failure and being on dialysis. And that further diminishes your quality of life, because you can't go everywhere with just a portable dialysis machine. And then you see peripheral vascular disease, diabetes, poor circulation, swollen legs from heart failure, all lead to limb problems, or you have ulcers on your ankles and your feet, circulation problems, eventually amputation follows after that. And then you're bedridden into a wheelchair or a prosthesis. And as you see here, the woman is checking her blood sugars because a lot of people nowadays are pre-diabetic because of the processed foods that we have readily available to us in the community. In the fast food combo stores is nothing but junk and high calorie, high fat, high salt, and these all destroy the body from within. And over time, they manifest as chronic lung diseases. In Africa, with black people, a remnant of some of the Hebrew Israelites, whether they know it or not, they're also going through their own thing of diseases. They may not go through hypertension and cholesterol and and diabetes and end-stage renal disease over there because they're more active and they're eating more healthy food, but they're going through other types of diseases like Ebola, tuberculosis, malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, monkeypox, HIV, hepatitis A, B, and C, dengue fever, typhoid fever, sleeping sickness from the tsetse fly, and cholera. So even though they may not experience what we experience from a westernized diet, when they come over here, they usually experience it, but over there they have their own host of problems, as we have seen on TV with Ebola hitting West Africa, Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, maybe some parts of Nigeria, and these are all prime hotspots in West Africa where it was known that the black Jews were living amongst. Here we see here that you see smallpox, tuberculosis, you see Ebola, education going out in Africa. So mostly all the deadly and chronic diseases in Africa are afflicting those in West, Central, and East Africa. This stretch of land in the olden days was called Sudan, S-O-U-D-A-N, but before this it was called Soyuda, S-O-Y-U-D-A, which was meant the land of Judah, because this was where most of the Israelite kingdoms and tribes are scattered and living in Africa. And it does not affect the Arab-populated North Africa for some reason. But we all know the reason behind that if we looked at the curses of Israel and see who was who. And so a lot of the verses that we see sometimes in Deuteronomy talks about the botches and the emerods. These are all boils and tumors and scabs and itching diseases that the children of Israel would endure. Diseases such as leprosy, Hansen's disease, syphilis, HIV, yellow fever, typhoid, Ebola, malaria, sleeping sickness, and tuberculosis, and dengue fever, and cholera, and which is diarrhea, hepatitis, and smallpox are all some of the diseases known to plague thousands of Africans every day. Like I said, however, the rates of these diseases in Arab countries such as North Africa, the Middle East, and Arabia are almost slim to none. Extreme poverty and poor living conditions cause widespread diseases and illness that affects blacks in other countries just like Africa. Here we see pictures of Ebola virus. It also spread in Uganda 2007. Deuteronomy 28:60 says, moreover, he will bring upon thee all of the diseases of Egypt, which thou was afraid of, and they shall cleave unto thee. So what does that mean? You say, well, all the diseases of Egypt that the Israelites were afraid of, they're going to be on the children of Israel. Well, in Exodus 9:11, when Moses dropped down the plagues on the Egyptians, it says, and the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. For the boil was upon the magicians, the Egyptian magicians, and also upon the other Egyptians. And here we see in Exodus 9, verses 8 through 9, it says, and the Lord said unto Moses and unto Aaron, take to you a handful of ashes of the furnace, and let Moses sprinkle it towards the heaven in the sight of the Pharaoh. And it shall become small dust in all the land of Egypt, and shall be a boil breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast throughout the land of Egypt. So this scripture said that the boils were also on the animals in Egypt as well as the people. And here you see a picture of a monkey with monkeypox. It's the same virus as smallpox. They call it monkeypox because it's on the monkey. And you can see the boils on the monkey's face, on his nose, around his mouth. And this monkeypox also afflicted West Africans and Africans in Central Africa and parts of East Africa. If you see here on the map, monkeypox hit in 1990, also smallpox in 1971, smallpox in 1958, and they still are experiencing smallpox as well, still in Africa. Now, the animals that the Egyptians liked the most, which they kept in their quarters, sometimes even were buried with them, were baboons and other monkeys, and they were pets to the Egyptians and the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. And they also had dogs too. And so here is a picture of ancient Egyptian walls with the picture of the monkeys sitting there. And with the question, are monkeys abundant in Russia and Eastern Europe, where the Ashkenazi Jews were from? And sadly, the answer is a big whopping no. So smallpox is one of the greatest scourges or diseases in human history. A disease which starts with a distinctive rash that progresses to a pus-filled blister that eventually pops. It causes a lot of itching. It can result and end up in disfiguration, blindness, and death. It first appeared in agricultural settlements in northeastern Africa around 10,000 BC. Egyptian merchants spread it from there to also India. And the earliest evidence of smallpox skin lesions has been found on the faces of mummies from the 18th and the 20th century Egyptian, well, the 18th and 20th Egyptian dynasties. And in the well-preserved mummy of Pharaoh Ramses V, who died in 1157 BCE. And the first recorded smallpox epidemic occurred in 1350 BCE during the Egyptian-Hittite War. The monkeypox transmission cycle in Central Africa, many believe it's coming from rodents, squirrels and rats, also monkeys, primates. Of course, if you eat also these animals or bushmeat, hunting, eventually the transmission can get spread into human beings, who then can secondarily transmit it to other human beings. And this is a picture of a boy with monkeypox. And just like it says in Exodus, the boil shall be upon the beast throughout the land of Egypt. And in the curses, it says that the diseases that the Egyptians had, the boils and stuff that the Israelites were afraid of because they didn't experience the plagues, they were also going to experience these kind of diseases because of their disobedience, all fall in line with the curses of Israel. So the question is, did this happen to the Ashkenazi Jews or the Sephardic Jews? No, it did not happen to them. Here you see here on display monkeys and dogs that are mummified. And this is at the Cairo Egyptian Museum in Egypt. Monkeypox also belonged to the same viral family as smallpox, and it killed hundreds of millions of people before it was eradicated in 1980. However, the subsequent cessation of smallpox vaccination has left people vulnerable to the monkeypox virus, which still causes skin lesions and blindness and death in up to 10% of cases. The monkeypox virus, which is first detected in monkeys, is primarily transmitted to people through contact with infected wild mammals. And these people can transmit the disease to other people in their household or to people at the hospital when they seek medical care. And it's also transmitted through just close physical contact, just like with chickenpox, or through contact with contaminated objects such as the patient's sheets. Like I said, it's prevalent mostly in West Africa and central Bantus African lands such as the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Congo is also Israel too, as you will see. And as you'll see later, many of the slaves that were brought to the east coast of America, such as South Carolina, were from the Congo region, as well as Cameroon and Nigeria and other areas. So Deuteronomy 28:61, it says, also every sickness and every plague, disease, which is not written in the book of this law, them will the Lord bring upon thee until thou be destroyed. So as I said earlier, blacks in America are dying left and right. at early ages from heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, infectious diseases, high cholesterol, end-stage liver disease, end-stage kidney disease, peripheral vascular disease, autoimmune disease, and cancer, and so on. The fact is the matter is that it's getting worse, and black children are now headed for a shortened lifespan, as pediatricians are now checking cholesterol levels and blood sugar levels in children. Studies show that black children are now exhibiting early signs of high blood pressure, heart disease, and plaque buildup, especially in the aorta and the arteries of the heart. They're also developing prediabetes, kidney disease at an early age, and cerebral vascular disease. And this is all happening in children. No longer are the children at schools in the inner city are they eating healthy snacks like fresh apples and fruit and fresh juice that's not concentrated and laden with a whole bunch of sugar. They are eating chips and pizza and fries and donuts and snack cakes and pies and everything else under the sun. And so you have a high incidence of childhood obesity. Even if looks may be deceiving, if the child is not obese, the child may also be pre-hypertensive and have a risk of developing diabetes. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the United States, but there's also, like I said, substantial evidence that the plaque buildup in the arteries, this process begins or started to begin in early childhood, with the presence of fatty streaks in the aorta, which is the main big vessel of the heart that comes out the heart and supplies blood to the whole body, by only 10 years of age, and then it also starts to show up in the coronary arteries at 20 years of age. So people are going to start living shorter lifespans, all because of these chronic diseases, and it's mainly affecting black people. Here we see a map of the current obesity rates among adults by race and ethnicity. This is back in 2012. Black people are leading the race, 47%. Latinos are right behind, 42%. That's not a coincidence, because they also have Negro heritage and stock, and Israelite stock as well, if you go back and do the research. And then whites are of course at the bottom, 32%. What about the children? Well, the children's obesity rates by race and ethnicity, as you can see here, actually Latinos are leading the pack, and then blacks are right behind, and whites are just about almost 10% behind blacks and Latinos in terms of childhood obesity. Deuteronomy 28:62 says, "And ye shall be left few in number, whereas you were as the stars of heaven for multitude." And back in the day, the children of Israel were plentiful, they were numerous in the land. But it says here, if they didn't keep his commandments, that they would die off, many of them, and will be left few in number in comparison to the rest of the world. So because they didn't obey the voice of the Lord thy God, that they would go through this, and they will be destroyed. And being destroyed meaning being plucked from the land, even the land that you don't possess. And throughout history, they have had a lot of eugenics projects, and a Negro project that has been designed to diminish the population of African Americans or Negroes. They believe in America that the Negro was a menace to American civilization, especially after being freed. They at one point contemplated sending all black people back to Africa, but then they changed their mind. And it was a known fact that they state that the first slaves to be brought into America was from the Dutch, but actually, well, the Dutch in 1619, but actually the Portuguese, actually you'll see later, was the first. And these slaves brought by the Dutch in 1618 were landed at Jamestown, Virginia. They documented that the first cargo consisted of 14 Negro slaves. However, in the span of about 200, maybe 250 years, that these 14 slaves, when they recounted the number of Negroes in America, the number had increased to 7,638,360 Negroes. This was documented by Mr. R.W. Schwartz, M.D. He's a white man back in 1906. They wrote a book about this. But, of course, he also attributed this number to the increase of more slaves that were being added to America between this time. Despite all the deaths in Africa, we see from starvation, disease, and civil war, etc., Uh, the Hamitic Africans are still very numerous. However, the children of Israel, the Israelites that are mixed amongst the Hamitic people in Africa, they're not as numerous as they were prior to these events because of these decreased population events that we talked about earlier with genocides and civil war, disease, and famines. And so the Israelites, black Israelites have been dying of genocide for centuries. It's still going on in America, and eugenics agenda to destroy black people and to keep the black fetus from growing, being aborted, or from black people from having families is still evident today. And it's constantly in effect by the elites to keep the black population down to a minimum. And you have to wonder why, over the years, have they put so much effort and time into keeping the black population down to a minimum. Because if you look on the maps, back in 1790, black people were 20% of the population of America. Back in, say, 1870, shortly after the slaves were freed, blacks were about 14% of America. In 2015, blacks are still 14% of America, and that's over like 140 years ago. Our population has not increased, even though the population of the world and the population of America has increased. Black people's percentage in America has not increased. The Latinos have actually surpassed black people back in 2000. They're coming up being close to 20% of the population of America. So we are the minority group, a major minority group in America now. And this is a picture of Mr. R.W. Sheffield, M.D. He wrote a book about the Negro, a menace to American civilization. There's many books written by white people that were anti-black. They wanted to kill off as many blacks as they can, and also talk about the traits of Negroes as if we are subhuman and are not allowed to, should not be allowed to live without being under the rulership of another race. So, moving right along, you see the Negro Project. A lot of different people wrote books and came up with different ways to institute eugenics. The Negro Project was one of them. Also, in cooperation with Planned Parenthood and birth control. The aim of the program, the Negro Project, was to exterminate blacks, but it was mainly to restrict the black population, which means basically exterminate the black population. If you couldn't actually kill them, you would lynching or shooting them, then you had to do another way to do it. So under the pretense of better health and family planning, Margaret Sanger is one of the pioneers in black eugenics, cleverly implemented her plan. Some within the black elite saw birth control as a means to attain economic empowerment, elevate the race, and gain the respect of whites. The NAACP at one point was for Planned Parenthood and abortion. In reality, this forced sterilization and abortion clinics and birth control pills were all designed by whites to eliminate blacks and thus keeping them from becoming significant in numbers in America, which they don't want, just like the Egyptians didn't want that happening in Egypt with the Israelites. Curses of Israel 28:64, we're almost finished. And the Lord shall scatter thee among thy people from one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. Black people have been spread all across the entire world as slaves to be forced to do the slave servitude labor for the rest of the world. People don't understand that if all blacks would disappear from the world, who would be the ones doing all the menial servitude jobs of America? Sports entertainment industry would have no business, and the South would be pretty much barren and desolate. A lot of black people live in the South, even to this day. We worship the religions of our oppressors. In the many nations we were used as slaves, and we now worship the material things that they entice us with, which also puts us into debt. It is a known fact that many Muslims in Africa have traced their family tree going back and found out that their grandparents and great-grandparents practiced Judaism or Old Testament law. And this is proof that over the years the Israelites and black Israelites, black people had changed their religions, just as the curses of Israel talked about. And Deuteronomy 28:65 says, and among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart and failing of the eyes and of sorrow of mind. So sorrow of mind, failing of the eyes, these are all, signs and descriptions of sadness, trembling heart, fear, no ease, meaning that you will see nothing let up, no help. Everything is going to continue to seem grim. And so a lot of blacks feel trapped in the system today where it's hard to succeed and even harder to follow your dreams. Many of us have dreams. We want to travel. We want to own businesses. We want to own vacation properties, or maybe even move to another country and live off the ocean and have an open house, just like what you see on TV when other races are buying Caribbean properties, and there's snorkeling and they're windsurfing and surfing, and they're doing everything under the sun, living your life. But that's not the case for a lot of blacks in America. A lot of blacks in America haven't even seen the ocean, even though they see it on TV and they learn it in school. So the morale of a lot of millions of blacks all across America is low. Some people have even actually lost hope and don't dream anymore. Just take it for what it is, and that's the way it's going to be, and you just live their life complacent and happy with their situation, and just accept that other races are just the ones that succeed in life and own businesses and get nice cars and houses, and they send their kids to public schools and they go on trips. They just basically understand and just accept the fact that other nations can do that, but we can't do that. We all know that education is the key to success, but education in the black inner cities is not a priority in America to rich whites or rich blacks, as we see more and more high schools and elementary schools, middle schools closing down in the inner city, in a nation that can print out money out of thin air. It's not backed by gold, and we can give other countries billions of dollars to stop their nuclear programs or to curtail their nuclear programs, and we can send money over to Israel. We can send money to every other country in terms of billions of dollars, but we can't save the inner city schools. Material things also seems to be a priority for enticing black people, and all of this stuff just basically keeps the kids to grow up in the same system that our past generations have had to endure to fight in. Not everyone is fortunate enough to make it out of their negative environment, to make millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars, and still at the same time give back to a dying community. Sometimes a lot of people make it. In terms of blacks, millionaires and billionaires, they don't give back to the community. It's just to help their family, and that's it. This constant struggle can easily make people lose hope. No reparations were given to blacks in America, but reparations were given to Japanese Americans, 1.6 billion. Austria gave the Jews 25 million Holocaust survivors. Canada gave 250,000 miles of land to the Indians and Eskimos. They also gave $230 million to Japanese Canadians. The United States gave 32 million from an 1839 treaty to the Ottawas of Michigan. The United States gave 31 million to the Chippewas of Wisconsin. They gave 12.3 million to the Seminoles of Florida. They gave 105 million to the Sioux of South Dakota. The U.S. gave 81 million to the Klamaths of Oregon. They gave 1 billion plus 44 million acres of land to the Alaskan Natives Land Settlement Agreement. Germany also gave $822 million to the European Holocaust survivors. Holocaust only lasted 12 years. U.S. gave $0 to African Americans, the black descendants of African Americans, for slavery and Jim Crow, which lasted for 500 years plus. The Arabs haven't gave us any money for over 1,500 years of Arab slave trade, and they're still taking slaves from Africa. And this is something that's going on, and we see that black lives don't matter to a lot of the other nations that have enslaved us and built their countries on our blood, sweat, and tears. but they call us that we're equal, and they say that we're all brothers and sisters. That's not the case. People are not showing this. So Malcolm X said that without education, you're not going anywhere in this world. Though studies say that black Americans don't suffer from higher rates of depression than white Americans from all this stuff going on, there have actually been studies that prove that many African Americans tend to repress feelings of depression and other mental health disorders. So they have issues of depression and anxiety and other things, and maybe be hearing voices or seeing things, have suicidal thoughts, but they're not going to see the doctor. They're not talking to anybody about it. Nobody's trying to talk to them about it. Everybody's busy working, doing their own thing. Historical relics of slavery, poverty, constant racial injustice seen on TV and experienced in the street, broken educational systems, poor living situations, unemployment, and broken homes continue to haunt African Americans today. This is a sign that more attention is needed on the mental health of black Americans. This causes sorrowness and a frailing of the heart and the mind, all basically listing the curse of Israel's. Like I said earlier, blacks living amongst each other often have developed a distrust that is not present with the white man. Blacks are subject to getting robbed in broad daylight and at night by their own people instead of someone of another race. Therefore, going out in the streets in the daytime or in the nighttime can be a struggle where people may be gripped with fear as the main stronghold in their own community. The same fear prevents us from rising up and making us stand united as a people to make a change to the system that has failed us, a system that has been designed for us to not succeed. But we have the power in numbers if we only practice unity in voice and direction. This is why a lot of black people are too scared to boycott businesses that are obviously not black owned. When people talk about blacks, we don't rally up and boycott. The NBA, they just took off their shirts and turned them inside out, but they continue to play the game, even though Sterling has made those comments, when the majority of the NBA is black. So we must demand for fair practices for our people. As we see on TV, with all the police shootings of unarmed black men and disrespectful racist comments being said about black people on TV, no one else is going to look out for us, and no one else is going to look out for our best interests except for ourselves. This is why we must be able to depend on one another in order to survive. It is literally going to be the difference between life and death in the long run if people, black people, do not take heed to the warning signs and wake up. Deuteronomy 28:66 says that, "In thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shall have none assurance of thy life." He sees a black girl crying. Deuteronomy 28:67 says that, "In the morning thou shalt say, would God it were evening, and at even thou shalt say, would God it were morning. For the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thy eyes which thou shalt see." Many of us, during the day or before I started the day, many of us will say, "Please, God, please let me get through this day." Whether you're at work and you're having a hard day at work, whether you had a hard day at work the day before and you're going to work again with a lot of anxiety, a lot of emotions, a lot of times a lot of black people will say, "Please let me make it through this day," because there's a lot of tension and stress, as we all know, living as a black person in America. Deuteronomy 28:68 says, "And the Lord shall bring thee into a land of bondage," or a second Egypt, "again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee, and thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy or redeem and save you." This is what the last curse of Israel talks about. And the words in Luke 24 also says that the children of Israel shall fall by the edge of the sword. Back then they didn't have guns. "And they shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down or taken over by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." So the Bible is telling us that we will not be allowed to peacefully return to the Holy Land or to our former land with peace until the second coming of Christ. Till then, blacks will face discrimination and suppression all over the world, no matter where we're at. As you can see with that scripture, it doesn't talk about taking Israelites or taking black people into Egypt with ships, because you can walk, as you see on the map, from Israel straight into Egypt. Only until recent did the Suez Canal become constructed, creating a waterway that you can take from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf and all the way out to the Indian Ocean. They did that so the boats didn't have to go all the way around Africa, around the Atlantic Ocean. They made that Suez Canal to create a waterway to ship oil and everything else. But as you can see here on the map, sending Israelites away into a second bondage into Egypt by way of ships doesn't make any sense, because you don't need a ship to go from Israel to Egypt. You just walk there. The Gaza Strip is right next to Egypt. So, folks, the second Egypt was the land of bondage. Bondage meaning another nation. Here we see the Jewish slave ship owners that owned many of the slave ships that took hundreds and thousands of black people to the Americas. Yet the European Jews say that they've been persecuted, all per the Bible. But how can the European Jews be led captive into all nations and at the same time be the ones doing the enslaving? They were the ones leading the captives into all nations. They weren't being led into all nations as captives themselves. So someone is obviously lying here. So people, we need to wake up. Here we see a picture of inspection of the sale of a Negro by European. Many of the European slave masters were Jewish. A lot of them changed their last names to have normal appearing last names so they wouldn't experience any type of anti-Semitism in America. And so you had names like Johnson and Smith and Thompson and all these different words. Rivers, Joanne Rivers is really Jewish. A lot of people, Douglas, these names, they're actually, the people there are actually Jewish stock, and the appearance of Jewish stock, they just changed their last names in America. Jesus was the name of the slave ship, captained and ran by Sir John Hawkins in 1564 by appointment of the Queen of England. Slave ships packed slaves on the ship. A lot of slaves, 292 slaves. Sometimes they packed even more, like 400 to 500 slaves. Didn't have a lot of water, not a lot of food. Sometimes they didn't have enough food to feed the slaves for the length of time that they were going to be on the slave ship, sailing across the Atlantic Ocean to America. Many slaves died because of this. So let's go. At this moment, we're going to take it back to the past and hit on some topics that apply to black people today to prove that we have just as much right and claim to being descendants of the ancient children of Israel, of the real Jews, than the European Jews and the Middle Eastern Arab Jews that we see today in America. So if we go back in the past, we will see, again, 1680, this is in South Carolina. 4/5 of South Carolina's population was white. However, black slaves outnumbered white residents 2-1 in 1720, and by 1740, slaves constituted nearly 90% of the population of South Carolina in 1740. But they were still enslaved by the slave masters, even though they were 90% of the population. That's a staggering number, and the Haitians back in the day, they realized that if they were outnumbering the white man, they can overtake the white man and kick him out of the country, and that's just what they did. Most of the growing slave population came from the west coast of Africa, a region that had gained notoriety by exporting its large rice surpluses. Spaniards also was buying slaves in Havana, Cuba. This picture 1837. As we see, Cuba has a mixed ethnicity of people. You see and it's the black women in Cuba, soldiers. You see a mixture of black and also lighter skinned Cubans. And it was a known fact that once Castro was in power, at some point he allowed a lot of the, well, I don't say he allowed, but a lot of the rich white Cubans had left Cuba and went to Florida, Miami, while the black, dark-skinned Cubans stayed. A lot of them stayed. So in 2002, 11 million Cubans, only 1.1 million considered themselves black, only 2.8 million considered themselves mixed mulattoes. In the paper, Genetic Origin and Mixture and Symmetry in Maternal and Paternal Human Lineage in Cuba, published in the journal BMC Evolutionary Biology, they concluded that the male Y chromosome for some 800 people tested in one study had no Native American Taino Arawak lineage found. It's just because the Europeans knew that to control a land and its people, they had to kill off the males or prevent the males from reproducing. The Arab slave trade was also known for the castration of males while they had sex with the black African women as concubines. This would ensure a high percentage of Arab blood, Y chromosome, in the offspring of these mulatto black Arabs in the Middle East, leaving minimal African blood. So did the native Arawak and Taino Indian men fight to the death that were in Cuba before the Europeans came with the slaves, the black slaves, or did they rather commit suicide than be enslaved under the Europeans? Some stories say yes. Now, the male chromosome, we all have DNA, and at the end of our DNA, we have either an XX chromosome or we have an XY. If you're XX, you're a woman. If you're XY, you're a man. If you have XXY, then you have feminized features. You may have small genitals and feminine qualities. These are all what determines our race. Well, this determines our sex. Most importantly, so when they test the Y chromosome, it's basically testing the paternal lineage. And when they tested a lot of the people in Cuba, they didn't find this native Taino Arawak DNA, because before the Europeans landed in Cuba, you had a lot of the Taino and Arawak people, and maybe even the Carib people that were living in the island known as Cuba. But when the Europeans got there, what they probably did was they probably killed a lot of the men off, or a lot of the men committed suicide because they didn't want to be enslaved under the white race of the Europeans. And over time, the Europeans may have also mixed their blood, the males with the women. And when the Negroes came, the Negroes obviously made it with other Negroes, and this is the reason why that they couldn't find hardly any of this Y chromosome on at least 800 people they tested in this one study. So in the same study, under using maternal ancestry DNA, which tests the woman side, maternal side, it showed that Cubans had 33% Native American blood, and they have 45% African blood and 22% European blood. So there you have it. You see that the women, if you follow the women in their lineage, you would see that a lot of the women, however, that the Europeans came upon, Europeans came into, the women were actually the native women, the Taino and the Arawaks and possibly the Caribs that were there in Cuba, and the European men and possibly even the Negro men, they intermarried and had sex with the native Tainos, and therefore you see this genetic finding in their blood. Most of it was 45% African, other strong number was Cubans, and then Europeans was last. Because you see a lot of Cubans that look pretty much white in appearance, and then you see Cubans that look more Afrocentric or more Negro. So remember, many of the Africans from West Africa came during the transatlantic slave trade to the Americas and the Caribbean. Actually, more of them came to South America and Central America than North America. Most of the Afro-Cubans now live in the east side of the island near Havana, Cuba. In 1959, during the Cuban Revolution, like I said, many of the European white professional class Cubans left to go to American Miami. This is why they're so prevalent and so prosperous in Miami, because they left and went there. Haitians also have been there, going there, but a lot of times the Haitians get sent back to Haiti and the Cubans get to stay. If we go by the male seed, we can always see that the Cubans are perhaps Hebrews too, because they have the Negro blood of the slaves that were taken from West Africa. In 1898 saw the ending of slavery in Puerto Rico, but the agenda there was to keep the black people as slaves as long as possible. This is a picture of black children slaves in Puerto Rico. So the agenda was to do anything they can to keep us down, to keep us enslaved. After keeping us enslaved, we were set free on the abolishment of slavery. The agenda was to keep us working for them, either as an indentured servant or just working for them, period. And so the slave owner basically was replaced by your modern manager. And it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between a slave owner and what a modern manager does, because both avoid mingling with workers unless he wants to for sexual desires. So slave owner didn't mess with the slave women unless he wanted to for sexual desires. And the modern manager nowadays at the job will not necessarily mess with the black female employee unless he wants to do so for sexual desires. But he probably will not want to marry her, but just carry on a relationship with her, a sexual relationship. And this is seen by black women when they talk about how white men or Arab men have hit on them at work, doctors and lawyers and nurses and people you would expect to not want to have anything to do with black people. But black women are usually desired by many other races, such as the white race and the Arab race. The slave owner and the modern manager often carefully monitored their profits. He had complete control of the workers, and he was not worried about worker turnover. As soon as one worker or one slave, say if a worker died or a slave died, he could replace it with another one. Same thing on the workforce. If a black person quits, they can hire another black person to take that person's job. Experiments for moving workers around for better efficiency or profits was often used by the slave owner to produce productivity of picking cotton. If you couldn't pick it fast enough, you couldn't pick enough weight of cotton in a day, then you were punished, and they usually had somebody else that could step up and do the job. And this was seen in the movie 12 Years a Slave, as the woman picked more cotton than all the men. And you see that the slave master continually demand higher levels of output from the workers. This is what the modern manager does for black people. He wants the black person to work super duper hard, often 2, 3, 4, 5 times harder than the white employees, because he has that control over the black employees. This is also done by the slave master. Also, it says here, number 7, workers' livelihood depends on the owner or the boss or the master, so loyalty is given. If you know that you have a house, you have a new car note, and you got bills, you got a new TV, you got all these things you got to pay, and you get a job, then the manager knows that he has your loyalty, because without him, you'll lose all these things. Especially if you just got a brand new car and you got bills to pay, you'll be as loyal as you need to be to this boss or master. And the same thing happened during slavery. So the slave master kept track of when the workers ate, when they had a rest break, or when they had to use the bathroom. At the job, we had to ask for a break. If we want to take a rest, we don't feel good, we have to ask the boss man or the master or whoever our supervisor is. If we want to use the bathroom, we got to go ask for permission to use the bathroom. Many jobs, they give you 2 15-minute breaks and maybe a 30-minute break, but you have to ask for it. You just can't take it whenever you want to. If you take too long, then the manager will scold you. It may even fire you or give you a strike. At 3 strikes, you're gone, and he doesn't think anything about what you got going on at home in terms of your family. This is the same way the slave owner operated his plantation. The slave master can transfer. He could transfer or send any slaves to another location to work without regards of the slave life. They did this a lot in slavery. They just sold slaves to other plantations or women. And in corporate America, working for different jobs, they can just transfer you to another location, sometimes disregarding your family, and uproot you to another state and just make everything a mess. The slave master also punished the workers for disobedience, even if the slave didn't do it. So if the slave didn't do it and someone said he did do it, the slave master would punish the slave with a beating. Modern manager, when he's over the black employees, even if a white person or another race says that you did something and you didn't do it, most of the times they're going to take the word of the white person or a person of another race, then agree with the black person. And this happens all too often in the black workforce. So at the end, basically, the slave master has complete control over the slave. The slave depends or learns to depend on his slave master. This is also seen in corporate or middle class or lower class America. Blacks, we work for jobs for 10 years or 12 years. We develop a dependence to that job, dependence to our boss, because we want to finish the role. We want to finish 30 years. We want to retire. We want to become vested and have all types of benefits. And so we put up with a lot of stuff that we don't have to. And normally we wouldn't want to, but because we depend on that job, we depend on that boss, we do that, just like the slave did for the slave master. And so this is another agenda that has continued on despite the abolishment of slavery, and it's mainly affecting black people because we are the ones working for mostly everybody else. Right here, blast in the past. 1935, Reuben Stacy was lynched in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, because he supposedly frightened a white woman, and he was hung in front of all the family. This agenda is to kill us for being black, because to them black lives don't matter. Another agenda is to keep us incarcerated. A new study of the M. Marit Rahavi of the University of British Columbia and Sandra B. Starr of the University of Michigan Law School shows that black Americans receive almost 60% longer prison sentences than white Americans who commit the same crime. The study covered 58,000 federal criminal cases and found that there was a significant difference between the sentences given to black people to those given to white people. Here we see another agenda was eugenics, black women in jail, District of Columbia. The doctors under contract with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation sterilized nearly 150 female inmates from 2006 to 2010 without required state approvals. The Center for Investigative Reporting has found at least 148 women received tubal ligations in violation of prison rules during those 5 years, and there are perhaps 100 more dating back to the late 1900s, according to state documents and interviews. These women were signed up for the surgery while they were pregnant and housed at either the California Institution for Women in Corona Valley State Prison for women in Chowkilla. Former inmates and prisoner advocates maintained that prison medical staff coerced the women, targeting those deemed likely to return to prison in the future. This was in 2006, all the way going to 2010, and even now, people say that there are talks in female prisons of sterilizing women as well. And the majority of women in prison are black women.